certainly no shortage of geopolitical flashpoints at the moment. Yeah. Russia, Ukraine, the Israel war with Gaza following the Hamas October 7th attacks. Not clear if that remains contained to Israel and Gaza. We've also got North Korea testing ballistic missiles. We've got flares up in the Red Sea with Houthi rebels firing at ships. And there is so much to keep in mind on that front. In fact, Natixis is rating geopolitics as the top risk going into 2024. How do you rate geopolitics as a risk in 2024?
It's undeniably important. And again, impossible to predict, but getting more and more obvious. And again, I want to answer it specifically, but I'll start at 30,000 feet at a macro level. It's no coincidence to me that as we're going broke and as we're debasing our currency, we're also seeing more extravagant war talk, drum rolls, and more fissures in the system. And there's a lot of reasons. Hemingway said, political opportunists, when their back's against a debt wall, will buy temporary prosperity by debasing the currency and then permanent ruin by finding war and inflation. We've seen a debased currency. We're having a gain with reported and misreported inflation, and we're constantly at war. And again, I always caveat by saying, when in terms of U.S. policy, I never being disparaging of the men and women who fight for our country or their own countries. In my finding, these are all, and I'll say it over and over and over, they're lions being led by donkeys. I think the policy in Afghanistan was a complete failure. I think we'd all agree. I know Marines who would agree with that, Navy SEALs who would agree with that. I think the Ukraine war was deliberately put in motion with no real interest in a peaceful settlement even before it started. I think the hundreds of thousands of civilians and soldiers killed is a war crime in and of itself by bad statesmanship from the U.S. and the West. I really do believe. So trying to predict foreign policy or geopolitical fissures, I keep going back to that Hemingway kind of theme, but it's not just Hemingway. It's very common to see financial fissures followed by militant problems, whether that's opportunism. Maybe Putin saw an opportunity under a weak White House to go into the Ukraine now. Maybe in Gaza and the West Bank, they see a less resolved West or a West that's broke its money financially in the Ukraine. Now's the chance to make a move. It's very hard to say. I also know that we can debate wars, whether it's in Afghanistan, whether it's in Israel, whether it's in the Ukraine, but money is money and wars cost money. And I think the U.S. has already stretched from years of failed wars and not failed soldiers, but failed wars and failed policies and failed statesmen. I think there's going to be more U.S. Treasury issuance as wars escalate, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in Eastern Europe, wherever more and more wars come to distract and create more war-type economies, we're going to see more IOU issuance that won't be paid for naturally. So we're going to see effects on the commercial markets as well. What's astounding to me when I look at the U.S. and its policies and what's happened to the neocon takeover of our cabinet and our Pentagon and the fact that we have basically three Pentagons. I think Mike Rogoff's book on the deep state is fascinating. But I think there was a time, even in World War II, before we knew all the facts of what Nazi Germany really stood for, right after the invasion of Poland, even prior to Pearl Harbor, America still was debating whether we should go to war at all. In World War II, which was a pretty obvious good war, and after Pearl Harbor, a very obvious war. And then after Nazism, we saw how seriously important that war was. In World War I, there was a great resistance to go to war. Two major world wars of which the U.S. played pivotal roles in necessary wars. And yet, since my birth, Vietnam onward, it seems like America is always at war. And none of those wars feel very good in Main Street. There's a whole disconnect. And I'm not talking about the Israeli war. I'm talking about everything up until now. That we're just always at war somewhere. And again, I would say our track record from the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq to the fiasco in Syria to Afghanistan debacle to basically a proxy war in the Ukraine has cost us a lot of money, cost the world a lot of lives, and killed American credibility as statesmen, as military might. And I think for the next leader or the current leader in the U.S. to show that they're meaning something, they're going to have to be more stringent in their war policy. And that scares me too. Because wars are devastating, but again, getting beyond the debates, wars are expensive, wars cost money, we're already broke. Our military is certainly strong, and we're not going to cut our military budget. We're not going to cut entitlements. And this goes back, sadly, to the less humane issue of just markets. We're going to go into greater and greater debt, and we're going to have to issue more and more U.S. treasuries. We're going to have to debase our currency to support bond yields. And all these things are connected, as we said from the very beginning. Even geopolitics, crypto, risk assets, the currency markets, the bond markets, the rate markets, and bubbles and pops are all tied to debt. And even war is tied to debt. And so, again, these are all interconnected themes for which no one has all the answers, and anyone who predicts them, I wouldn't trust. The difference between 1939 or even 1971 and today is A, all the world is broke at the same time. B, we're in a nuclear era. That's difficult to have strategic uses. There are many experts who would disagree with me. I think the stakes are much higher now. A hot war with Russia or China, I don't know how you, even if you win, how do you win? How do these proxy wars play out in the new paradigm of the 21st century and the kind of weapons we have and the kind of foolishness we have at the Pentagon and our State Department? The combination of all these things is scary. So the risk as countries go broke to try and distract or create growth or through GDP through wartime economies. In a lot of ways, the U.S. is a wartime economy that's not officially at war. But the way we issue treasuries and the way we support our bond market and the way our balance sheet looks like we're at war all the time. So what will another war do to our balance sheet and our credibility? I don't know. And really, who are making the decisions? Who are making the decisions in Washington, D.C. and the White House? Even the weaponization of the dollar was something Barack Obama said we should never do. It would destabilize our currency, it would put the world reserve currency status at risk. And this was Obama in 2015. Robert Triffin came to Congress in the 60s, said, don't do this. John Maynard Keynes says, don't weaponize the dollar. Despite all this, somebody in the White House made this decision. I don't think Biden has the IQ to make that on his own. I don't. So it makes you ask, who's really making these decisions? And so these are scary questions I don't have all the answers for. But that tipping point, the Grant Williams that I talked about from day one of the sanctions, the weaponization of the dollar has led to a weaponization of just about everything. The countries that are broke get more and more desperate, whether it's weaponizing the DOJ, whether it's weaponizing the Wall Street Journal, the Bezos Post, whether it's weaponizing YouTube or Facebook or Google for political reasons. Everything is getting more and more centralized. And that, as I've always said, is the end result of any broken regime. It's throughout history. You have a market crisis, which is driven by a debt crisis first. Always a debt crisis, market crisis, currency crisis, inflation crisis, and then more centralized control from the extreme political left, name it Bolshevik, or the extreme political right, name it fascist or pseudo-democratic. But we always see this throughout history. This centralization, this militarization, this weaponization theme is everywhere right now in the world. It's right in the land of the free and the so-called democracy of the U.S. Again, my country, I still love it more than any other country in the world, but it's not the country I studied in law school, civics, constitutional law. Even the universities I went to are unrecognizable to me because I can't speak my mind or take or not take a vaccine according to my own free choice, which is everything the law school taught me to value. Those law schools won't let me in now if I don't get a certain policy that I don't follow a certain way. I just don't recognize these things anymore. That's a sign of centralization. That's a sign of why there's so much social unrest, distrust, polarization. People are reacting to this control in different ways. Those who really want freedom value it. They'll discuss it. They'll argue it left or right. Those who have nothing to lose don't care because they have nothing to lose.